Johnny McFadden here with episode number 2 of the somewhat tentatively named West Virginia Cannabis Corner. My guest today is Greg Gerdeman. He's a neuroscientist, he's a professor and educator. He was in the ground floor of the Florida medical cannabis industry. Now he's a fellow permit holder with me in West Virginia, and we're doing our part, trying to at least, to fulfill our obligation, we believe it is, to educate people about this plant and the upcoming industry that's coming up. So this is a really long one. I really didn't really want to edit anything out because there was just nothing that deserved to be edited out. So sit back and just enjoy some really in-depth information about cannabis science, policy, and even some history as well. All right, I'm here with Greg Gerdeman. He is the co-owner of Weir Wellness in Weirton, West Virginia. Great alliteration. I'll take any chance to use alliteration when I can. Greg, you're just about the most credentialed person I've ever met in the cannabis industry. And that's saying a lot because in my short career in the cannabis industry, I have met a lot of really knowledgeable people. So thank you so much for joining me today. And I'll just say I'm happy and pleased that you're a part of the West Virginia industry. Um,
Thanks.
so, so tell people about that extensive background and really just, how it informs your thinking on cannabis science and cannabis policy.
Okay. How I got to be some of my friends want me to call myself the the weed wizard of Weirton, just for
That's
your
pretty
for
good.
your
That's pretty good.
alliteration.
I like
Um,
it.
I come into this from a background of being a brain scientist, which is a little bit different. And it certainly was very different when I started because I started a graduate program at Vanderbilt University in 1996. And that was a point in time. I mean, I didn't go to graduate school to study how cannabis works at all, but I was a mind and brain kind of person studying like cellular mechanisms of learning and memory. And I was in the right place in the right time when endocannabinoids had just been described. There were a very small number of labs worldwide interested in this. If you were studying cannabinoid receptors, which had been identified only a couple years earlier, then you were interested in, drug abuse. And that was it. It was very, research has been very controlled over these decades, as you no doubt know. But we knew that cannabis plants make a variety of different medicinal compounds, and especially ones that are called cannabinoids that are unique to cannabis. And about the early 1990s, it was discovered that our own bodies and brains have receptors for these compounds that became called cannabinoid receptors. And we have molecules in our body, neurotransmitters, signaling molecules, if you will, that are very much like THC. And they were called endogenous cannabinoids, which was shortened to the term endocannabinoids. In the same way that endorphin is actually a contraction of endogenous morphine, molecules that act like these plant products. So when I was starting grad school, I wasn't there to study marijuana, but I was studying the cellular basis of how the brain works. And these endocannabinoids had just been discovered. And to make my story short there, I made some key discoveries early on. And I got known in that very small scientific community internationally that was studying the cannabinoid system. It wasn't a study of interest because of being stigmatized and related to just cannabis abuse. Mainstream neuroscientists weren't so much interested in cannabinoid function because they weren't studying drug addiction, and that's how myopic that was. Even though our brain and bodies are teeming with cannabinoid receptors, and it's been an extremely exciting field of discovery to be involved in because the endocannabinoid system has taught science, taught society a lot about the biology of wellness, not just the biology of how cannabis works. And it has helped to snowball the movement of cannabis as medicine, turning into an industry of cannabis as medicine. Because when you see all of the ways that cannabis claims to be helpful and that people claim to be finding benefit from medical cannabis, there really is a biological scientific rationale. And it can be hard to believe sometimes because growing up our older generations were, we learned that there's just no medicinal use, and now we claim that there's so much potential. That's because of the extensive biology of the endocannabinoid system. So I started out studying, making some key findings with the endocannabinoid system, and it started to fit with how patients, starting on the West Coast, were being vocal about using cannabis as medicine. And I started to get around, some patients and patient advocates and physicians that would start to gravitate sort of in the orbit of this pretty small group of scientists worldwide that were studying the endocannabinoid system, because some of these patients and advocates and physicians were just certain that the science was on their side. And through that, around 2002, 3, 4, I started advising and consulting and meeting people who were doing sort of cooperative grows in California, and the first cannabis dispensary in British Columbia, which wasn't in Vancouver, it was on Vancouver Island, called the Vix in Victoria. And and it was just fascinating, right? And I started to pull away from doing um, organized animal research, which is what my PhD work was on, and really being more, kind of an anonymous advisor to cannabis education and the movement. I published quite a few things in sort of cannabis culture publications back then under pseudonyms, because I was interested in preserving my grant funding and
Wow.
having a
I didn't
trajectory
know
as
that.
a I did as a
Well,
college
things have changed a
professor.
lot. I mean,
Things
you
have
wouldn't have
changed
to
a
do that
lot.
now, would you?
No, actually, there's
Well,
a decent little pitch I could make. I'm looking up for his book. The Ed Rosenthal is the name of a fairly, I mean, over time he's been a pretty notorious grower and advocate. He's one of the only people who's writing books about how to grow cannabis throughout, prohibition years, and using his real name. I wrote a chapter for one of Ed's books, the third edition of the Marijuana Growers Handbook, which is like curriculum at Oaksterdam University, which is one of these schools that teaches cannabis from a broad perspective. Ed is releasing the sort of what he says is going to be his final version of his famous cannabis growers guide. It's going to be very post-prohibition viewed. It's coming out this summer. It's got a lot of very intelligent, interesting people on the real agronomy of cannabis and how to grow it and what its ecology is like. And I've got a chapter on the endocannabinoid system, and I'm using my real name for sure. And I didn't back then because I was concerned about it affecting my ability to get federal grants or getting a tenure track job at a college. Um, and to condense my history a little more, um, I started reflecting on what I wanted to do. I became a college professor. I moved to St. Pete, Florida, where I got a job as a college of a biology faculty member, professor at Eckerd College, a little liberal arts school in St. Pete, which I loved. And I continued research on that level and teaching a lot of pre-med students. All through this time, I was lecturing to physicians. I give continuing medical education about how cannabis works. Um, and um, Florida started changing to make that story kind of short. There was a ballot amendment to legalize medical cannabis as an amendment to the Constitution. The first go around failed, but I published an op-ed that got attention from the folks who were sponsoring it. And they asked me if I wouldn't mind giving some, speaking. So I started while I was still a college professor, giving some, like debating psychologists and sheriffs and people like that who were concerned about medical cannabis. And and that got me in contact with my colleague Robert Tornello, who had an organic produce farm and wanted to turn it into a cannabis farm. So we put together an application and ended up being one of the early license holders in Florida with Three Boys Farm. So I became chief scientific officer for a vertically integrated, grow, processing, retail cannabis company. And I resigned my tenured college faculty position to jump into this crazy industry
Yeah.
that's not very stable because it's trying to create something new. But in that, the last few years, then I continue to educate and on various platforms. But I've had a hands-on experience with kind of every level of where the medical cannabis industry deals with. I've directed pest management of greenhouse grown cannabis in Florida. I've set up extraction labs. I've worked with extraction and for making derivative oils and products. Um, and and I didn't get as much role in the dispensary side of things there because I left the company before that got set up. And lo and behold, I moved to West Virginia. I'm up here in Weirton in the Northern Panhandle. Well, I live in Follinsby. Um, with my business partner, Aaron, who is a nurse who's served this community for 15 plus years. And um, we, the applications were opening. We put together an application for a dispensary. I didn't really have the time or real estate in hand to apply for a cultivation facility, but we have a truly independent West Virginia owned and operated, although they're not operational yet, um, sort of call it a mom and pop dispensary, and really looking forward to serving this community in a way that's education first and science first and helps to remove the stigma of this medicine and make it available and help West Virginia participate in what is a tide change, a beneficial tide change that can help the local economy as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, you mentioned stigma, and we also talked about how things have changed so dramatically. Even in my short time in the cannabis industry, which I guess I would say started in 2017, it basically went. Me and Andrew Wilson, who is my partner with Mountaineer Integrated Care. We looked at each other in 2017, and we became aware what originally got us interested was we became aware of kids in West Virginia who and in other states who were suffering with various conditions, and their moms were forced to become criminals to give them relief. And we got together and we decided, okay, we're going to do something. And then a month later, um, the legislature passes the Medical Cannabis Act, and so we kind of like took credit for that, even though we hadn't done anything yet. We just decided that we wanted to do something, and then since that time to from 2017 to now, I mean, I've seen a dramatic shift. Um, I went around to county commission meetings and city council meetings, and really anybody who would listen to me, and told them why they should be excited about cannabis coming to their town, and how prohibiting cannabis coming from their town is not only a bad idea. You're turning down revenue, you're turning down jobs, but it's just also cruel, to especially on the medical side of things. So really, and now really I see almost no pushback for medical cannabis. Of course, you see some, but
Right,
no legitimate, really concerning pushback about medical cannabis as a whole.
right.
Um,
This is reflected in all kinds of national polls over the years, and
yeah,
it's right now nationally. I would bet, you know, big that it's the same in West Virginia, that safe access to medical cannabis is more popular than any single politician. And that has been part of the tide
it's not
change.
even close.
No, it's not even close. I mean, we live in such a polarized age. Like if one side of the fence says we should stop at red lights, the other side is going to say no, you shouldn't. I mean, there's so much bickering, but cannabis is incredibly bipartisan and more on medical use. But let's face it, more adult use, give people the freedom to use this for other purposes, without serious disorders. That's polling much more popular over time too. And I reject the kind of metaphor of saying like medical is like a slippery slope to recreational adult use because that implies going into something dangerous. I think it's more that, look, medical cannabis has gotten more and more popular in no small part because everyone is one step removed from someone who's benefited from it in their life. And there's so many people have stories of people who've resoundingly had improved quality of life from discovering medical cannabis, regardless of your political orientation. And as that has progressed too, people just realize it's not as bad as we've been taught as far as the health risks. So, but it is a safe medicine to try. First and foremost, that's my messaging. Cannabis is a very safe medicine to try. It has been used throughout human history. It was a mainstay of American pharmacology 100 years ago. And it's this prohibition of the last 50 years, 80 years, has really been the anomaly in the long relationship of humans with cannabis as a medicine. When I started in a PhD program, it gave me sort of the academic, like, I don't know, arrogance or confidence. But ever since like 1998 or so, when people ask me what I do, I'm like, well, I actually study the science of cannabis. And in 98, people didn't, I mean, living in the South or wherever, people didn't even know what cannabis was, right? That word wasn't even in the vernacular. You'd have to talk about marijuana. Um,
Which, of course,
but
if people don't know, I mean, is really a, you could be described as a, not a slur, but um, you know, a, what the government purposely called it to associate it with um, Hispanics, to tie all of these things together. Um, we won't go over the whole story of reefer madness and how really the whole fear of it was really um, built by Nixon and people like him, but people should definitely know that, and that's why I always use cannabis, because that's what it's called.
yeah, I mean, it is. It's a history of propaganda. You know, the American government, back with the Marijuana Tax Act, that really was the federal linchpin. But other states had been criminalizing marijuana since the early 30s. And it was based on anti-Mexican immigrant and fighting over the Western states. And it's always been xenophobic. It's always had a racist angle to it. That is the prohibition and calling it marijuana. And when it was made illegal, the only group that really stood up and objected to it was the American Medical Association, because they're the only ones who knew what they were talking about. And they were like, "You're calling it this slang word when we know it as cannabis or uh, Indian hemp or these other tinctures that they just saw it as an ingredient in a lot of patent medicines." But it's been effective. It is important to know that history. If only, well, there are lots of reasons to understand it, and it's a deep dive all in itself. But one reason it's important to know is that we have been misinformed. And one of the things I really admire about Dr. Sanjay Gupta, who working with CNN really helped blow open um, the CBD therapeutic uses, is Dr. Gupta was very humble and on national, special televised, event with that CNN Weeds program, saying, "I've been part of the problem. I apologize. As a physician, I have spoken incorrectly about the dangers of cannabis." And that's something that different elements scientists have to say as well. You know what? We've promoted wrong thinking about it, and so do politicians and law enforcement and physicians. That we've been wrong, and we should accept that. Look at the evidence and allow patients to try using something that is really remarkably safe. This isn't controversial scientifically to say that cannabis has an extraordinary safety profile compared to prescription drugs, compared to over-the-counter drugs.
I mean, I can't
Cannabis
think of
has an
a
extraordinary safety
substance
profile.
period that's not doesn't have a single attributable death. I mean, I'm sure people have died from caffeine and
Oh yeah.
nicotine. I'm sure
Well,
it's
you look at
happened.
something like ibuprofen kills 10,000 plus people a year
Oh yeah.
from gastric bleeding, kidney damage from taking too much. For the extent that cannabis can have a very profound experience, that it can be profoundly affecting your mental state, the fact that it doesn't have lethality is really just remarkable. It can be taking too much THC can be a very distressing experience. And those of us in the industry need to be responsible when it gets to help inform patient consumers about this, help doctors educate their patients that the side effects of taking too much of the medicine at once, but it is not going to kill you. And and it's easily avoided. And tolerance can be built very rapidly to some of those more discomforting side effects.
Yeah, I mean, what I tell people is, some people use cannabis and it has a tremendously positive effect. Some people use cannabis and it has probably a neutral effect. Some people use cannabis and it probably has a negative effect. But yeah, compared to these other substances, and especially the public health implications compared to something like alcohol is just really hard to even comprehend. And let's stay on kind of the federal, and we'll get back to West Virginia, of which I love so dearly, and that we're a part of the industry here. But let's talk about the actual science of cannabis, and the FDA's position and the federal government's position. And really, I mean, we've touched on how we got here, but and I hear it a lot too, is well, it's not an FDA approved. If it was FDA approved, I'd be behind it. But I mean, what really is going on there with the FDA, and how we got here?
Well, so people ask this question, like, how is it possible if cannabis has so many potential benefits? Like, why isn't it FDA approved medicine? I mean, and since we've already introduced some of the history of how it got prohibited, it's worth looking at where the FDA came from, and that the FDA is a regulatory body. It came into its modern form in like the early 1940s, but its predecessor started in at the turn of last century, and it was really focused on food safety. There were meat packing plants that were just vile, and there was no governmental oversight to protect consumers from, you know, toxically contaminated food. And that was really where public health regulations over food got its start about 120 years ago. By the 1930s, what became the FDA was starting to be concerned um, with not only claims of safety but efficacy. Um, that you needed to have some evidence that these medicines that were being peddled in one way or another worked. Um, but that really didn't get codified until the 40s. That you had to have like sort of drug trials to show efficacy to get approved. And drugs that had long history of just accepted medical use, like aspirin and morphine, they were kind of grandfathered in. They never went through the kind of rigorous uh, phase 3 blind placebo-blinded trials that are required now. Cannabis certainly could have fallen into that category as well, but it had been prohibited through the Marijuana Tax Act. Um, jump through day. I mean, we understand now vastly greater than we used to about how cannabis is medicinal through these cannabinoid molecules. And it's not controversial to say that cannabis got a tremendous treasure trove of medicinally of potential medicines in it, right? Even if you're hedging your bets, it's not controversial to say there's
And
a lot
maybe
of medicine
some
there.
even unknown
Yeah,
with these
yeah,
minor
maybe.
cannabinoids.
And it is the sort of the scope of the endocannabinoid system that speaks to how therapeutic it is. I mean, we know that every organ system uses the endocannabinoid system to help maintain a healthy balance. And so again, it's very mainstream scientific pharmacological thinking that targeting the endocannabinoid system could be helpful for irritable bowel, anxiety, neurodegenerative diseases, all kinds of diseases that are affected by chronic inflammation, because the endocannabinoid system is part of our body's natural way of tuning down inflammation. And the fact is, like it or not, the cannabinoids in cannabis, including delta 9 THC, evolved to work very much like our own system and to tweak it like that. So, um, we know a lot about how cannabis works, including how it mitigates pain on different levels. Um, but and THC and CBD as isolated molecules actually are FDA approved compounds. Uh, Dronabinol, which is trade
The
name Marinol,
GW isn't the CW or the CBD company, or what's the company
GW
called again?
Pharmaceuticals,
That's right.
GW Pharmaceuticals in the UK has a couple of cannabis extracted medicines. And the first one to get FDA approval is a CBD extracted isolate called Epidiolex that was
That's right.
finally approved for the severe pediatric epilepsies that, you know, parents were taking kids to Colorado to take full extract high CBD cannabis oils for their epilepsy. GW Pharmaceuticals got Epidiolex FDA approved for that purpose. They also have a medicine called Sativex that was it was their first flagship, but it has had more trouble getting approved. That's a 1-to-1 balance of THC and CBD and is approved for treating multiple sclerosis in something like 29 different countries. And it's being used for intractable pain with cancer as well in some countries. Um, but there's FDA approval at least for Epidiolex right now, and for Marinol, which is a semi-synthetic THC that's used to control appetite and vomiting in cancer chemotherapy and HIV chemotherapy. This was approved in the early 80s, in no small part to head off the cannabis legalization effort that was going on then. That there was a big movement, and Marinol was approved on the
Yeah.
strength of like 3 clinical trials. That was it, and it got approved, and it's pure THC basically. So there's issues there. There are the newest debates around or initiatives around trying to sort of control the cannabis industry and spread reefer madness, honestly, is the idea that if your product has a too high of a percentage composition of THC, that it's more dangerous. And yet the FDA approved through its clinical trials a pill that's 99% THC 40 years ago. So it's not about the percent of THC. It's about how much you take that can get you into an adverse experience. And so, yeah, there's the issue of there's lots of reasons why FDA approval isn't there. You have to do a whole rigorous set of experiments, and there's no will to do that. Taking a plant-derived product all the way through the hundreds of millions of dollars to get FDA approval is something that traditional drug companies haven't done. They haven't seen the profit goal for that. And academic institutions can't go through with it because it's so prohibited to work with because of the Schedule 1 status. And there's only one farm in the United States that is a approved source of cannabis for research at the University of Mississippi that has the monopolistic contract with the National Institute on Drug Abuse. They grow very subpar cannabis as far as it doesn't reflect the quality that's on the market right now. But doing research with that is notoriously hard. One could look up and find all kinds of evidence online. My good friend Dr. Sue Sisley just has published finally work that she's been involved with for years in Scottsdale, Arizona, using flower herbal cannabis with U.S. combat veterans to treat post-traumatic stress disorder. And they finally released the results of that study, and it showed that it was that it was a safe treatment that didn't complicate conditions. Um, the overall movement was patients reporting benefit, but it didn't reach statistical significance. And one can reasonably point to the fact that they were smoking very low potency, low quality product that was nowhere near what the quality you could get in a regulated state, you know, dispensary market.
Well, it's a lot of interesting things there. One thing that comes to mind is just interesting, funny, maybe not the right word, but the heuristics around synthetic and natural, where oh, because it's man-made, it's healthy or appropriate. Meanwhile, I mean, I've heard a lot of, not a lot, but I've heard some kind of disturbing stuff about synthetic cannabis and generally you know causing worse effects or not as good as effects as natural cannabis. Of course, you know, I don't have the scientific background to really speak on that, but it's just an interesting bias people have against something that just grows in the ground, which would make me think that it is healthy, or at least make me at least consider it. But the broader point, that's kind of really the story of um, you know cannabis policy to me, is this chicken and egg situation where there's just not enough research, but also researching it is illegal, and we never plan to do any research.
You know, researching the prohibition on research since 1970 with the Controlled Substance Act, making it Schedule 1, which it was done contrary to the whole board of experts that was appointed
Yeah, they
by
set up a
President
commission.
Nixon.
Okay, tell us whether we should do this. They said, do not make this illegal. They said, we're gonna make it illegal because
We're
that's what
gonna,
we wanted to do in the first
yeah,
place.
thanks for your input. We're going to make it strictly legal and state that it has no accepted medical purpose and that it cannot be administered safely. These are tenets of Schedule 1 that are absolutely, frankly, ridiculous. They are also ridiculous for other compounds like LSD and psilocybin, for that matter, but we don't need to go there at the moment. But the Schedule 1 status for cannabis is absurd. It's never, ever been based in science. So we're at this point now where those who are reclaiming cannabis as a safe natural medicine are are charged with, well, show us the science that shows it. But nobody ever had to use science to justify its prohibition. We can point to a rich history of medical use, and it's not just that people used it in ancient times. It's people that were the founders of Western medicine used cannabis. One of the examples is a fellow named Sir William Osler. He is considered the father of Western, sort of modern Western medicine. He was an original founder of Johns Hopkins Medical Center. He wrote he called cannabis indica the most desirable treatment for migraine headaches, for example. Um, Other physicians used it for epilepsies, for seizures, for James Parkinson, whose name is on Parkinson's disease, used hemp extracts in the treatment of those motor disorders. And now, 120 years later, we have to go through a rigmarole with lawmakers who don't know this history and challenge the notion that you have to roll out Parkinson's patients who say, no, it helps me. And we've erased a great deal of history there. Um, yeah, I could talk about that kind of stuff all day.
Yeah, I mean, we understand, political expediency is really the reason for the policies, and not actual facts or science or anything like that. Hey, I understand political expediency. Do what you got to do to a certain extent, but also in West Virginia, at least, I'm going to do everything I can to make purposeful ignorance no longer tolerated.
Yeah,
Um, because and to make it no longer politically expedient, because that's just how our system works. That's the really only way to change things.
yeah. And people in West Virginia shouldn't be afraid about the way the state is going. I mean, excuse me, the federal government has a certain inertia to it. There's going to be reform, but right now, I mean, there are some 38 states that have in mostly legalized cannabis in some way or the other. I forget the exact number, but there's, West Virginia was held up for a while based on a fear that the state couldn't bank. Like your first guest last week, or your first
Yeah,
podcast
we
guest, was
deep
in
dive into
banking.
that, and it's another kind of scenario of nobody really wanted to solve the problem, is why it didn't
Right,
get solved.
right. And it's just the the federal government is not going to come in and shut down government banking. They're not going to come in and take away grants from major research institutions for handling a Schedule One substance. We have moved into an era where there is a de facto kind of acceptance that states are exercising their own rights to set up their own programs. And hopefully, in the not distant future, that will expand to allow awful, regulated, safe cannabis transactions across state lines. That should happen. And
Yeah, well,
patients
people,
in West Virginia should be able to get cannabis now in order, because they can't wait. They've got
I'll tell you, people are they're very antsy, and they've waited a long time since 2017, and they thought it would be, you know, maybe 2019 at the latest. They people thought that this was going to be here, and every day it's not here, and both of us are working our tails off now to try to bring it to patients as soon as possible.
the systems in place now, right?
Yeah,
Growers are getting set up, but it is a plant, and you do have to follow quality control to make sure, cannabis is a safe natural medicine. But when you're growing it at scale, it needs to be grown carefully and cleanly. Um, as I tell people, you know, romaine lettuce has killed many more people than cannabis has or ever has. And that's not because romaine lettuce is unsafe, but growing it to scale for at agriculture leads to sometimes microbial contamination that has led to recalls and that kind of thing. When cannabis grows to scale, there are risks associated with that too. If there have been any fatal deaths directly attributed to cannabis, it's because of things like aspergillus that were molds contaminating the cannabis. That it was a question not of the plant being dangerous, but of poor quality control.
and regulated markets is the only possible way to try to stop that. I mean, with the West Virginia program, we had to put in applications that are hundreds of pages long, oftentimes, that are detailing basically every single um, aspect of how we're going to operate to the state government. I mean, and talking about West Virginia, I'm optimistic, and we have some incremental changes. We did get past the banking issue. We did get basically the effective use of flower. How it's put in code is really weird, but effectively, flower is legal right now, and a couple other things to make things more affordable. So, like I said, I'm optimistic. Our
It is
work is certainly
also
not done. Go ahead.
no. Well, I was just going to add that for people tuning into this in a timely way, um, there's a bill in the legislature that would allow uh, edible products made in the industry and regulated and tested. I think
SB
that's a very
590. It's
SB
looking
590.
pretty
There you
good.
go. It's going into what it passed the Senate, and it's going into House committees. So
It's in House Health right now. Yeah.
people calling their delegates to support that is a good thing. Many, despite this the sort of stigma that most cannabis patients are going to be young guys looking to get high, most cannabis patients are going to be over 50 and looking to stem chronic pain and chronic anxiety, and having a nice dose regulated, gummy or uh, edible that tastes good and is easy to take, a capsule. This is something that a lot of patients will choose. Now, a lot of patients will also choose the most natural form, which is the flower, and as you said, that is going to be legal in this state. We as dispensaries cannot promote or encourage people to burn it and smoke it like that. And technically, that is not a legal and accepted form to use it. Um, we all know people will, in the same way that people are using cannabis as medicine now. That's part of the undercurrent that can't be ignored. Cannabis as medicine wasn't invented by this act. It's it's allowing people to be legal with something they're already doing, and allowing people who really want to follow the law and would never break the law to try medicine that could improve their quality of life greatly. Um, people who are suffering from cancer, every single cancer patient should be able to try cannabis to help them survive with quality of life through the tremendous challenges of battling cancer, and the toxic therapeutic approaches that are used.
Yeah.
Um,
I have a family member with cancer, and I've spent a lot of time over the past couple years in oncologist offices, and I've met a lot of people, and I've met people who um, are starving to death just because they
yeah,
can't keep food down. And I've met people who told me cannabis has saved their life. Um, and when you tell that to West Virginians, I won't, try to, give a overarching definition of what West Virginians are, but I believe that they're um, compassionate, caring people. And when they hear that, um, like I said, I've really gotten almost no pushback.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. No, it's what, and same here. I am met with reservation, sometimes mostly from older folks. Um, but so when we were meeting with county boards of health, and yeah, there are folks who have reservation. There are law enforcement concerns that are perfectly reasonable, that are usually abated when officers have deeper conversation about how controlled this is going to be. I mean, look, I was on a web meeting earlier today before you called, before this, talking about the point of sale software and experience and online advance ordering and the kind of system that we're going to have. These dispensaries are going to be fun places to work in. Like, I'm not going to, this is a little bit of a tangent because of what we were doing, but the dispensaries are going to be safe. They're going to be secure. You can't just come off the street without a medical card.
I'm more
Everybody's face
secure
is
than a
going to be on
pharmacy.
camera. It's going to be more secure than a pharmacy. Our little dispensary in Weirton is going to be the most secure business other than banks, probably in the whole town. And it's going to have cool tech to work with as an employee. People talk, and I know this is something dear to your heart, the notion of bringing industry to West Virginia that helps enhance livability here, helps keep young people in West Virginia. And having a cannabis program legitimately is part of that, because it's not just something we've won the right to do. I were wanting to relocate a company to Weirton, West Virginia, or anywhere else, and I'm thinking about quality of life for my employees. What I mean, if you're coming from relocating from San Diego or Seattle or Denver or Pittsburgh, people want to have access to safe medicinal cannabis. It is part of the American cultural landscape, the medical landscape. And these can be cool places to work. They're entrepreneurial. You got to work hard. You got to have a passion for the industry, but there's there's interesting tech involved. There's the medicine
Yeah, so
plant
much
that we
ancillary stuff. I
revere.
mean, you could make a software company and just serve, West Virginia cannabis companies. And as you mentioned, is something I'm really passionate about. I mean, it's something that's talked about at the state capitol this year and the past couple of years ad nauseum, as we lost quite a bit of our population. Is, okay, how do we keep young people in the state, specifically young talented
Yeah,
people in the state? How do we bring new people? I don't care where you're from. We'll take anybody we can get. And Greg, and now you've moved to West Virginia, and there's a lot of people like you who are flooding into the state just because of this industry. And as a young person, I'll tell people this is an industry that gets young people excited. I mean, when has
yeah,
an industry ever um, come out of thin air? Not quite, but come out of thin air like this, where you're not taking jobs from any other sector. You're not taking resources from any other sector. You're solely taking it out of, the drug dealers, that are we still have negative feelings towards, and that's fine. But we're taking that straight out of that market and putting it into this other market where we are taxing it, and we're actually
Yeah.
seeing economic development instead of supplying illicit drug markets in other countries. Bless you.
Excuse me.
Bless you there.
You know, that's a good point, and there's truth to be said that a lot of the cannabis industry, for during the times course of prohibition, um, I have great respect for some people who are breeding and growing and making cannabis available, because it has never been a just system of law to prohibit it the way it has been. But my dispensary, as you point out, and others up here in the Panhandle or wherever in West Virginia, where we live, I every single week I'm reading about a new level of bust of methamphetamine traffic and fentanyl and the opiates that are moving up and down the Ohio Valley. And um, that's the business that we will cut into through legal, safe cannabis. There's no reason that people should be seeking cannabis as their medicine from folks that are contributing to that trade. Um, you know, and the last thing another thing to point on is just that I'm hoping that cannabis can be used more as a direct therapeutic approach to combating opiate addiction, because in West Virginia, as I don't have to comment about how devastating the opiate crisis is in West Virginia. Everyone feels it to their bones. Everyone's lost people, um, and in these recent months, as the cannabis industry is getting launched, you can't see a popular media story about it or politicians talk about it without addressing like economic growth and jobs, like we've mentioned, and part of the solution to the opiate crisis. Well, how does that work? Well, for one thing, primarily because people with chronic intractable pain can get a cannabis recommendation and try it instead of and there's a real biology to how cannabis can synergize with opiates. Even if someone is taking a prescribed opiate medication, they can use less of it if they've also got medical cannabis. And we call that an opioid sparing effect. And it's something that I hope that people in general, the public health community, start to understand, that pairing the judicious use of cannabis with less, I mean, opioid medications can be very good medicine for acute pain, not so good for chronic pain. We can dial down their use safely with cannabis, but people do get addicted to opiates. And there is good evidence that cannabis can help them transition, be part of their strategy for transitioning off of it. And we need to have mature adult conversations with the treatment industry, with lawmakers, with law enforcement, about how that could work. But right now, that's not an accepted medicine to try. You can't go to your doctor and be honest with them and say, I want to get cannabis because I can't stop the opiates and I need help. That's not an acceptable reason to try this very safe natural medicine according to the law of the state of West Virginia. And that's something that needs to change.
Well, the refrain you hear the most often is basically something like, we can't legalize cannabis because it could, put fuel on the fire of our already existing drug problem. Which is just another dog whistle for, I don't really want to do it, so I'm not going to. It's, it's just a dog whistle for, well, I haven't really researched it, so this is all I have to say. I'm going to say this one liner. I've never heard that kind of comment backed up with any kind of science.
No.
Um,
That falls on the notion that like all drugs are the same, which falls flat on its face. Cannabis is very different from opiates, and uh, it's it, it it is a solution that it's not like a magic pill that's going to stop the crisis, but it is combating the fire with safer alternatives
Well,
that biologically help you transition away. They can.
you mentioned, right now it isn't, opioid use disorder by itself is not a qualifying condition. And so, if you're really worried about it, that's how the situation is in West Virginia right now. And if we can simply provide an alternative for these chronic conditions, chronic pain, chronic whatever. Chronic means it's pretty much lasting your whole life for a long period of time. If you give somebody opioids for a chronic condition, in my uneducated mind, I'm like, aren't they almost guaranteed to get addicted if you're taking opioids for years?
Nobody should be taking opioids for years.
We're talking about chronic conditions.
And clinically defined for chronic pain, a chronic condition is something that the time course of which has lasted longer than expected. So it doesn't need to be a lifetime sort of thing. Someone longer than expected, or gosh, I forget really where the definition goes, but somebody with rheumatoid arthritis, for example, which is one of the most expensive conditions, maybe the most expensive conditions as far as the cost that is spent medicating people with rheumatic disease. They absolutely should qualify for a medical cannabis recommendation under the state of West Virginia. If a physician is confident following the letter of the law, someone with arthritis very well may have chronic, even severe and intractable pain. Um, these people should realize that they have a right to get a medical cannabis recommendation under the current law. Now, arthritis isn't the greatest example for what we're talking about because no doctor would prescribe opiates for arthritis. But even with an injury, work-related injuries that last longer than you think they should. But hey, what does that mean? You hurt your back, it's going to hurt you for a long time. And opiates are not effective. The scientific evidence says they're not good medicines for effectively treating chronic pain. So we need answers. And cannabis is definitely part of that. And if cannabis is involved in the front end with acute pain, which opiates can be very effective for, then they can help reduce the amount and maybe allow, because now we're on this sort of swing in medical prescribing of opiates that right now we're in a place where so many doctors are tight-fisted with it that a lot of patients are denied opiates when they really need something.
And that's not acceptable either. That's not an acceptable
No.
outcome is, okay, we're just going to let these people suffer.
No.
That's not
integrating cannabis is, it's not so straightforward as, hey, everybody should use it, but it should be part of the conversation with any, in my perspective. I'm not a medical doctor, but I've taught a lot of them and I understand the practice of medicine a great deal. And in my view, anybody who's having a clinical consult dealing with an issue of pain management, cannabis should be part of the conversation. Maybe just high CBD cannabis, but also, a THC as well.
Well, you mentioned the carnage that's taking place in West Virginia, and the last thing I'll say about the opioid issue is I have people close to me that have been affected. People in my graduating class of not too long ago. There's already a body count.
It's painful.
And I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if I've ever seen anything that would indicate that this would make this problem worse. In fact, I got into this because I just felt it was so cruel that families were forced to become criminals. Seeing the potential for economic development that I've been told my entire life, our biggest problems are a lack of economic development and jobs and an opioid epidemic. And in the cannabis industry, I saw something that I could, hopefully do some small part and to help all of those issues, at least a little bit. And I've said many times, cannabis is not a silver bullet to all of our problems. But if that's the requirement to get started, then we've just got no shot. We'll never even start to solve our problems. Um,
Cannabis is
I'm hopeful. I am hopeful.
me too. Cannabis is a therapeutic, oftentimes healing ally towards approaching our problems. Sometimes that's the best you can get, and sometimes that's a very good start. And you were saying, how you've come into this and everything, and maybe we'll start wrapping up with me too, saying it. I was on a trajectory to be, very just sort of ivory tower researcher or a college professor, and just I'm a booky nerdy guy. I can keep my head to the, to my desk. Um, but through science and trying to understand new things, well, let me put it this way. The reason I was working in a lab long hours is because, like anybody who goes into that sort of research direction, I wanted to contribute. I was hopeful, maybe I'll discover something that really helps psychiatric disease. Like, actually, do I dare hope that I could help cure something? But I want to contribute understanding the neurology in the brain because I want this research to help people. That's why NIH gets billions of dollars in tax money as a noble research endeavor. It's to help understand and better manage and treat and hopefully cure human disease. And I consider myself really, really lucky that my discoveries did point somewhere. Only I can't say I discovered it because it's been discovered over and over again throughout human history, and it's a natural plant. And that I saw people suffering from it, from lack of access, or for having their medicine taken away from them in those early days, and it still happens. And if it is maintained in a legal framework, it's still going to happen. And we need to do what we can to make cannabis safe, accessible, and just part of the wellness conversation.